Hello again. Stars are a really important symbol in Elden Ring, so this video is going to be about 3 really important star symbols that I've found all over the Lands Between. These symbols are the Blood Star, the Moon of Noxtella, and the Eclipsed Sun, and the context around these symbols can give us a lot of information about the lore. I'm probably going to make some connections between things that don't seem connected at first, but I think that that's because we actually know a lot more about the lore than we think. The best way I can put it is that the lore is presented to us like a big puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces. But I think that it's actually a much smaller puzzle because the pieces connect to each other in ways that we don't expect. A good example of this would be finding out that Miquella and St. Trina are one person. It was 2 puzzle pieces that are actually one. And I think the game is full of stuff just like this, so I'll do my best to explain, and I just ask you to keep an open mind. The Blood Star is only explicitly named in the Thorn sorceries, but I think there are ambiguous references to it all over the place. The weapon Great Stars mentions a blood-stained star that I'm pretty sure is the Blood Star, and it has a 6-pointed star on its pommel. I think the 6-pointed star is one way the Blood Star is portrayed, but it can also appear as something like one central dot surrounded by 6 others, or an object with 6 bumps and something in the middle. If the player chooses the Samurai starting class, they'll begin the game with the Red Thorn Round Shield and Land of Reed set. The red thorns on the shield are probably the thorns created by Thorn sorceries, and the Land of Reed set mentions a blood-soaked madness. So I think the Blood Star has something to do with the madness plaguing the Land of Reeds. The ceaseless lust for battle that raged within Hoarah sounds a lot like the blood-soaked madness in my opinion. And it makes me think that the Blood Star probably had influence in the Lands Between before the Age of the Erd Tree. The ritual sword talisman says that the Colosseums were used until the end of Godfrey's reign, and I think bloodshed and madness were a big part of this ritual combat. The Erd Tree bow says that faith and battle went hand in hand long ago, so I think the Colosseums were used before his reign too. Starfist is found right next to the Colosseum in Lindell, and its description says it was used in brutal boxing matches and designed to induce blood loss. The Mad Pumpkinheads are called gladiators and fly into a panic where they attack everything around them if they're exposed to bloodshed or the sound of insects. The Swarm Pot and Swarm of Flies incantation are 2 things capable of triggering this response in a pumpkinhead, and they're both closely connected to blood and the Formless Mother. Swarm of Flies is one of Mohg's blood incantations, and the Swarm Pot sounds like it creates the exact same kind of flies. The flies consume blood, and the incantation implies that they come directly from the blood swamp around Mohg's palace, so I really think the Formless Mother had something to do with the Colosseums. In my opinion, these arenas imply that the blood-soaked madness of the Blood Star was present in the Lands Between during the early days of the Erd Tree, and maybe even the time before it. I keep finding connections between the Blood Star and the Formless Mother, also known as the Mother of Truth, so I'm pretty sure they're connected somehow. The most obvious connection is the fact that one is called the Blood Star while the Formless Mother has all these connections to blood incantations and blood flame. Another is that the blood incantation says the Formless Mother craves wounds, and thorn sorceries wound the caster. The dancers in the village of Windmills use an attack where they wound themselves by biting their hand to spit a mist of blood. They wear 6-pointed stars on their chests and have blood all over their faces, so I think their reckless attacks and strange behavior could be the result of the Blood Star's blood-soaked madness that's also present in the Land of Reeds. Speaking of the Land of Reeds, Yura, Eleonora, and Okina are all from there and have ties to Mohg. Okina and Eleonora probably have some of Mohg's blood inside them, because they're 2 of 4 NPCs called Bloody Fingers, and White Mask Vade siphoned some of Mohg's blood into our character before giving us the Bloody Finger. Yura hunts the Bloody Fingers, and on his waist is what I think is some kind of 6-pointed star talisman. I think he got the talisman in the Land of Reeds, and it would make sense if the 6-pointed star is the Blood Star responsible for the land's blood-soaked madness. I'd also like to note that a majority of the weapons that come from the Land of Reeds inflict bleed, so the name Blood-Soaked Madness probably isn't a metaphor. Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear says that the Formless Mother bestows power upon accursed blood, so I think she has some kind of influence over the accursed. The Omen are some of these accursed beings, and they have a lot of similarities with the Crucible aspects as well. All Omen obviously have horns, Morgott has a tail that looks a bit like the Crucible aspect, and Mohg grows wings in his second phase that are similar to the ones manifested by Crucible Knights. If the Omen have so many similarities to Crucible aspects, I think the Formless Mother has a connection to the Crucible of Life as well. I think the Blood Star was important in the time before the Erd Tree because there are 6-pointed stars in places that I'm pretty sure were built before the Erd Tree existed, like Marika's bedchamber and the entrance to Rhea Lucaria. It's often in places that seem to be related to the Erd Tree as well, so I think the star could be related to the Crucible of Life in some way. The Crucible is the primordial form of the Erd Tree. In other words, what was once the Crucible of Life went through a series of changes until it became the Erd Tree. Primordial means that it's the Erd Tree's most basic form, and that nothing came before the Crucible. The Fire Giant's shield and Giant's red braid both depict 6-pointed shapes, and the Fire Giants predate the Erd Tree. The Fire Giant's forge is an extremely important symbol to them, so I'd like to mention that the word Crucible could have an important double meaning with that context. A crucible can be a container used to extract metal from ore in a process called smelting, which may sound familiar if you've played crafting RPGs. Gold is called something like life itself, so this could mean that the Crucible of Life was made of or contained something like smelted gold. The art of smithing was said to be divine when the Giants invented it, so I think they may have once used their forge to create new forms of life from the Crucible. Primordial gold is a special kind of gold because it has a reddish tint that marks it as being close to life itself. I think the Crucible of Life could be made of primordial gold because it's a part of every piece of equipment used by Crucible Knights, and the word primordial is associated with the Crucible of Life constantly. There are a lot of connections between the Crucible of Life and dragons too, particularly ancient dragons. For starters, dragons have scales, knotted bones, and feathers, which are all represented by the Crucible talismans. The Crucible aspects all manifest traits that dragons have, like fire breath, horns, a tail, and the Crucible Knights even use a wing aspect. The Gravelstone seal says that lightning is imbued with gold, so that should mean red lightning is imbued with red gold. The seal also says that worshipping the ancient dragons doesn't conflict with worship of the Erd Tree because ancient dragon scales and lightning are both imbued with gold. This means that the worship of the Erd Tree and the ancient dragons are also the worship of gold, and therefore life itself. The weapon Siluria's tree says it's modeled after the Erd Tree's crucible, so that probably means the Crucible of Life. The Crucible tree helm has the same ornamentation as Siluria's tree, because they're in the same set, and its description calls it Great Tree ornamentation. This means that the Crucible of Life is the Great Tree, and therefore the Erd Tree's primordial form. There's even a carving above the entrance to the Erd Tree that depicts a large tree with a smaller tree on top of it. That really makes it look like the Erd Tree grew from a larger tree, which would have to be the Great Tree. I don't see what else this kind of imagery could mean, honestly. I'm open to other theories, but they'd have to be able to explain why this image is presented front and center on the object of the entire continent's faith. The Erd Tree could be called something like the most important cathedral in the lands between, and almost every symbol in a cathedral will obviously be loaded with religious importance. Also, I'd like to address the fact that there's an Erd Tree crest on the festive garb's cape. The fact that there are 6-pointed stars in Marika's bedroom, along with this cape, could mean that the Blood Star has some connection with the Erd Tree too. The Erd Tree grew from the Great Tree, so they could just see it as something like the current form of the Great Tree, but that's just my best guess. The bottom of the Great Tree design on Siluria's tree shows 6 large branches, and there are also only 6 at the top. There are even gaps between some of the branches that would have been large enough for extra ones if they had wanted to add them, so it feels like an intentional choice to me. I'll admit that this could be a coincidence, and I definitely understand if you disagree about there being 6 branches. I just feel like this was a detail worth sharing. We reach Far Missoula through the Forge of the Giants, and at one point we find a Crucible Knight standing in front of the body of an ancient dragon. All of the gold has been stripped from its body, and the torches surrounding the ancient dragon's body look just like the altars at the Dragon Communion Cathedral and Church that we use to perform Dragon Communion. In my opinion, this makes it seem like the Crucible Knights may have performed some kind of Dragon Communion with the ancient dragons that involved taking their gold. If lightning is imbued with gold, and the ancient dragon's red lightning is imbued with primordial gold from the Crucible of Life, then the ancient dragons wield the power of life from the Crucible of Life. So the ancient dragons probably worshipped the Great Tree in a way that could be compared to the worship of the Erd Tree. If the Great Tree was being destroyed to create the Erd Tree, it would explain why Grandsax recklessly attacked the capital by himself. It's like he was desperately trying to save the Great Tree, which would make his final pose really depressing. He's looking up at the sky in a way that looks almost like he's pleading, and it's entirely possible that the last thing he saw was that he had failed, and the Great Tree was lost. The Three Fingers seem to have several connections to the Blood Star and Crucible of Life as well. The guilty were able to find the Blood Star because they were blinded and lived in eternal darkness, and the Three Fingers guided Hyetta with a distant light even though she was blind. If the Blood Star is connected, then the fact that Hyetta is blind could even be an important part of why she was being guided. The Shield of the Guilty describes a maiden whose eyes were crushed by the briars of sin before being reborn, and I think this may explain why Hyetta and Irina look and sound exactly the same. Hyetta suddenly appears after Irina's death, but Irina's body can still be seen. If Irina was reborn as Hyetta, she may have been born into a new body without some of her memories, like Renala's juvenile scholars. There are a ton of misbegotten in Hyetta's birthplace, Castle Morn. It seems like they were once normal people that changed when they made contact with the Crucible of Life. So I think Castle Morn had some close connection to the Crucible and the Three Fingers. Hyetta asks us for a Shabriri grape when we first meet her, and says she's been eating them to see a guiding light, so she probably has a history with Shabriri grapes. Hyetta is probably being drawn to the Three Fingers like the guilty were being drawn to the Blood Star. The Three Fingers want to melt everything back together into the One Great, so they likely represent a remnant of the One Great that wants to be whole again. This makes the Three Fingers a pretty perfect example of the law of regression, by the way, because trying to continually return to a previous state until you reach the beginning is basically what the law describes. The One Great is almost definitely the Crucible of Life because they're both described as primordial objects that contained all life within them, and the name One Great isn't that far off from Great Tree. I mentioned the six-pointed star and use of self-wounding blood attacks at the Windmill Village earlier, but there's actually a bit more to that. A Godskin Apostle can be fought at the Windmill Village, and it drops the Godskin Peeler. One end of the Godskin Peeler is described as winding and designed to bore into flesh. The exact same words are also used to describe the Bloody Helus, which is carried by servants of Moog. I'm not an expert in, let's call it leather making, but I'd imagine that before the skin can be removed from something, you'd need to bleed it. The Gloam-Eyed Queen led the Godskin Apostles, so she may have had something to do with the Blood Star and Crucible of Life too. She once held Destined Death before it was sealed away by Malekith at the beginning of the Golden Order and the Age of the Erd Tree. In other words, the Age of the Great Tree ended when the Gloam-Eyed Queen was defeated. I know it sounds weird to say that the Gloam-Eyed Queen held the Rune of Death and also had connections to the Crucible of Life, but she's associated with birth a lot. We can see this in the Godskin Swaddling Cloth and some figures in Farum Azula that I'll be going over in a future video. If I had to sum up the Blood Star in one word, I'd say it's life. I agree that the Blood Star, Formless Mother, and Gloam-Eyed Queen all seem like they're closer to death than life, but it can be hard to tell because of the way they interact with one another in Elden Ring. The remembrance of the regal ancestor says that birth and death create life, so life and death are a lot closer than they seem. In other words, it wouldn't be strange at all for a figure that represents death to also be associated with birth and life. The Black Moon of Noxtella was an object that once hung above the Eternal City and guided stars. Memory stones are actually pieces of the Black Moon, and they're made of a black stone that's described as beguiling. The Nox live in the Eternal Cities like Noxtella, and they've been anticipating the Age of Stars. I believe Ranni's Dark Moon is almost definitely the Black Moon of Noxtella because Ranni's ending is called the Age of Stars, and the names Black Moon and Dark Moon are barely different. I think this Age of Stars would probably resemble how things were before the creation of the Erd Tree and beginning of the Golden Order. The stars once guided fate, but the moon once guided stars. So I think that's a roundabout way of saying that the moon guided fate. That's why the moon plays such a large role in the Eternal Cities and the Age of Stars that they're waiting for. Fate is an interesting word because it can mean destiny, but it can also mean death. The sayings meet your fate and ultimate fate both mean death, and you may have noticed that the Rune of Death is also called Destined Death. After we defeat Radahn and set the stars in motion again, Iji says that Sellen has lost her immortality and calls her a Carian weed. He could mean she's been like a weed to the Carian family, but it sounds like she lost her immortality because the Carian family's fate was set in motion. When the Fingerslayer blade says that it can't be wielded by one without a fate, I think it means that one must be capable of dying to use it. I think that we find Ranni's puppet body limp and motionless before her dead Two Fingers because she died after using the Fingerslayer blade to kill it. When we start to fight the baleful shadow that looks like Blythe, Ranni implies it's the last of several shadows that she's already defeated. Then she tells the baleful shadow that she's on her way to deal her two fingers a fateful wound, ne'er to heal. After beating the shadow, Ranni says, "Farewell. Tell my friends and/or family I love them," which pretty much feels like a universal way to say I'm about to die. So Ranni used the word fateful to mean fatal, and really strongly implies that using the Fingerslayer blade will kill her. I think Ranni is able to come back to life after this because we unknowingly give her primal glintstone back to her. When Ranni killed her original body with the black knife, I think she was using it like a primal glintstone blade. The blade's description says that she had to die to make her primal glintstone, and the Rune of Death is the only thing that can kill a demigod. I'm pretty sure the Dark Moon Ring is Ranni's primal glintstone, because when we place the ring on her finger, she's completely fine all of a sudden. When she gives us the discarded palace key, she's choosing us as her consort and literally placing her life in our hands all at once. By the way, if you look really closely at Selen's primal glintstone, you can see something that looks like a fetus. Primal glintstones are used for rebirth, so I think giving them associations with wombs is a pretty cool detail. Helphen's steeple refers to a tree called the Helphen, which was a special kind of tree called a lampwood. If a lampwood is a large, special tree that shines with a light that looks like grace, it sounds like the Erd tree may be a lampwood too. I think grace could be like a kind of lamplight, and Marika may have even sent the Tarnished to wage war and die so that they'd be able to see grace. I mentioned before that although it's said that the stars guided fate, the moon was actually guiding fate by guiding the stars. If fate and death can mean the same thing, then that means the moon guides death by guiding stars. The Helphen was known for its black steeple and also guided the dead, so I think it's closely connected to the Black Moon. I think the glorious death mentioned by the Great Ghost Glovewort and Red-Feathered Branch Sword could also have something to do with the guidance of the Helphen's lamplight. Either way, the Helphen could probably guide the dead in more ways than one, because the skill of Helphen's steeple summons Ghost Flame, and grave violets are believed to be useful in calling forth spirits because they're the hue of Ghost Flame. The Dark Moon Greatsword is said to be a beam of the moon's light, and if you look at it closely, you'll see a branch. It's been stylized a bit to look like ice crystals, but you can still make out leaves and other plant-like details too. If a beam of the Dark Moon's light looks like a branch, then the Black Moon probably has some kind of connection to trees. A cold ghost flame is used by both the Deathbirds and Helphen's steeple, and the Dark Moon is mentioned by almost every cold sorcery along with several items that inflict frostbite, so ice and cold damage are pretty closely linked with the Dark Moon. I also want to mention that there are birds at the top of the Moon of Noxtella talisman, but the way they're posing makes it look like they're probably cuckoos. The Deathbirds once burned death in Ghost Flame, and Ancient Death Rancor summons vengeful spirits that it calls cinders of the Ancient Death Hex. Embers are the smoldering remains of a fire, but cinders are like embers that aren't smoldering anymore. So embers still contain fragments of fire and could be used to start a new one, but cinders could be compared to something that's been charred, like a lump of coal. If spirits are cinders of Ghost Flame, they're partially burned, and spirits are what's being burned to fuel the Ghost Flame. This may sound obvious when I say it out loud, but Ghost Flame is essentially fueled by burning ghosts. Death's Poker says that Deathbirds burned things in kilns, and kilns can be used to cremate bodies. So the Helphen could even be where the kilns of the Deathbirds were, or are. In Noxtella, I happened to find something that looked like a plate or shield decorated with 9 round shapes surrounding a circle that looks a lot like the Moon of Noxtella talisman. If you look closely at those shapes, you'll see silhouettes that are shaped a bit like the grace floating above sites of grace. Dark Souls vets may also notice that they look a bit like humanity too. I think those silhouettes may represent spirits or souls, and that this is a depiction of the Moon of Noxtella guiding the dead, confirming its connection to the Helphen. Rosus was, or maybe is, the Usher of Death, and his axe literally mentions guiding the dead and depicts him doing exactly that. I'd also like to mention that the word Rosus is Latin for gnawed at or eaten away. The weapon's description says almost the exact same thing that the Tibia summon's description says. The axe's skill, Rosus's summons, almost has the exact same name, and the two attacks do almost the exact same thing, so to say they're connected almost feels like an understatement. Helphen's steeple is even dropped by a Tibia Mariner, so I'm pretty confident that they played a key part in guiding the dead for Rosas and the Helphen. There are beings that escort the dead in so many belief systems that there's actually a special word for them. They're called psychopomps. The word comes from a similar sounding Greek word that literally means guide of souls. It's not uncommon for these psychopomps to be ferrymen, like in Greek and Egyptian mythology, because rivers are associated with things like death all the time. I think that in Elden Ring, the underground is like the underworld of the lands between, and the Ainsel and Siofor rivers were once used by the Tibia Mariners acting as psychopomps. In the age of the Erd Tree, the catacombs were built around the roots of the Great Tree, because they reached everywhere and connected to the roots of the Erd Tree. The souls of the dead are meant to return to the Erd Tree through its roots, so I think that souls return to the Great Tree through its roots in the time before the Erd Tree. The Deeproot Depths map says that the Great Tree once stood where the Erd Tree is now, and that both of the underground rivers flow directly from a source of water at the tree's base. I think that Tibia Mariners brought the dead up these rivers to the Great Tree's roots, probably under the command of Rosas. When we beat Malekith and released the Rune of Death, it was unsealed and went from a physical object to something like a presence or an area of effect. During that same cutscene, Enya says that the lands between are being shrouded by Death's dark fate. The plant form of the Rune of Death, Deathroot, may allow the Tibia Mariners to do their ancient jobs by shrouding areas in death the way they would have been before the Erd Tree. It's also spreading through the roots of the Great Tree, so Tibia Mariners may be able to reach the surface by traveling through the roots of the Great Tree. The Tibia Mariners have raised throne-like seats on their boats, and they look a lot like the giant thrones that we can find by the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella Site of Grace and Knight's Sacred Ground. The Site of Grace by the Empty Throne in Celia calls them chair crypts, and I think they had something to do with Rosas as well because they're all in places important to those associated with night and therefore the Black Moon. I mentioned earlier that the Helphen and Black Moon have a pretty strong connection to almost everything related to ice and cold damage, and the Dragonkin wield lightning made of ice. I think the Dragonkin are descended from the ice dragons that served the Black Moon as lords of the mountaintops long ago, when the moon guided fate. But that story probably deserves a video of its own. The Eclipsed Sun is only explicitly mentioned by 3 items. The Eclipse Crest Heater Shield and Great Shield say that the Eclipsed Sun is a symbol of the wandering Mausoleums. The Eclipsed Sun protects soulless demigods by helping the headless Mausoleum Knights keep destined death at bay until they can be revived. So this seems to imply that before the Rune of Death was sealed and the Golden Order began, the demigods could go through a cycle of death and rebirth. The third item to mention the Eclipsed Sun is the Eclipse Shotel, which is a treasure of Castle Sol. I think Castle Sol's connection to the Eclipsed Sun are why there's a wandering mausoleum right beside it, because the Church of the Eclipse is also in Castle Sol. If the Blood Star represents life, and the Black Moon is death, then it would make sense for the Eclipsed Sun to have connections with rebirth. In fact, it would make the Eclipsed Sun a pretty perfect representation of life and death overlapping one another. If you saw my video on magic crests, then you know how often the 8-pointed star appears. Like the 6-pointed star, this symbol doesn't always look exactly like an 8-pointed star. It often appears as something like one central dot with 8 dots around it, like the Eye of the Fell God on the chest of the Fire Giant boss. A similar design can be found on the Troll's Hammer and at the top of the Divine Towers. I'd also like to mention that there's a star on the Guardian Garb with 8 points, and when you look closely, you can see a moon. I've been able to find enough connections between them that I'm pretty sure the 8-pointed star is just another way to represent the Eclipsed Sun and the boundaries between life and death being blurred. The Eclipse Crest Heater Shield even shows an eclipse crest with 8 large points. The pattern on the Eye of the Fell God could represent the rebirth or reawakening of the Fell God through the body of the Fire Giant boss when he burns his leg as a sacrifice, and also a great demonstration of death creating new life. The hammer could have the symbol because they were used by trolls to create new life in the Giant's Forge, but that's just my guess. A deeper explanation of this deserves a video of its own, but I believe the cosmos had a connection to death too. The 8-pointed star at the top of the Divine Towers has a meteorite at its center, so I think that this could mean that the towers served as a connection between the living world and the cosmos of death, but I do need to look into that more before I can be sure. The Serpent Hunter was a weapon created long ago to hunt the immortal serpent, and it has an 8-pointed star on the pommel. When the spear is used against the serpent, it emits a blade of light surrounded by wind, and I think that may hint at an affiliation with Stormveil. Stormhawks, Banished Knights, and Golems all use wind to attack in some way and are all connected to Stormveil. There are statues of Banished Knights in Stormveil, and most golems can be found around places connected to the Banished Knights, like Stormveil and Castle Sol. The ability to control wind seems to be closely tied to Stormveil, or at least its former inhabitants, so the Serpent Hunter and Eight-Pointed Star probably are too. While we're talking about connections between the Eight-Pointed Star and Banished Knights, I should say that the exact same star design found in Castle Sol can also be seen in Farum Azula, and there are Banished Knights there too. This version looks like it's made of 8 circles that produce a pattern resembling a star with 8 rays of light. The claw mark seals used by Farum Azula's beastmen are even lined with a string of 8-pointed stars too. The black leather shield depicts an 8-pointed star and calls it the Polar Star. The shield comes from somewhere cold to the north, and I think that's probably Castle Sol. Magnetism is a polar force because it involves 2 opposite charges, positive and negative, so the Eclipsed Sun is probably called the Polar Star because it represents 2 opposing forces, like life and death, at the same time. Farum Azula is surrounded by powerful winds and a storm beyond time. If the Eclipsed Sun and 8-pointed star do have something to do with the Stormhawks and wind, it could also be connected to the true storm mentioned in Stormhawk Dean's Ashes. My working theory is that there was a falling out between the Stormhawks and ancient dragons that once lived in Farum Azula, and it ended when the Stormhawks trapped the dragon's city in a storm beyond time. I'm still looking into that though, so I can't say anything for sure. The Eclipsed Sun is the symbol of wandering mausoleums, and the Azula Beastmen ashes call Farum Azula a mausoleum, so I think the Eclipsed Sun may have played a similar role for both of them. In other words, the Eclipsed Sun may have once kept destined death at bay for the ancient dragons in Farum Azula, or something like that. It would explain why they're called immortal in some item descriptions, even though there don't seem to be many around anymore. A cool detail about the inside of the Wandering Mausoleums is that there's a chandelier, or maybe some kind of ornament, hanging from the ceiling that looks like the Crucible of Life. It's right above the headless body on the altar, so it probably represents the mausoleum's purpose of granting new life to the soulless demigods. I mentioned that the weapon Great Stars has a 6-pointed star on it earlier in the video, but there are actually 6 and 8-pointed stars on the weapon. I think this means the 2 stars are the Great Stars, and that they're connected somehow. The Crucible ornamentation in the Wandering Mausoleums could mean that the Great Stars are both related to the Crucible of Life. We can find 6 and 8-pointed stars in Farum Azula, and I made some connections between the Ancient Dragons and Crucible of Life earlier in the video. I'm pretty confident that all this is the beginning of a much larger connection between the Crucible of Life and Farum Azula, but I'm still looking into it. The mausoleums are guarded by knights that wear deathbird ornamentation, but I think they wear it because of the fact that deathbirds burn death in ghost flame, rather than a connection to the deathbirds themselves. I mentioned before that ghost flame comes from burning ghosts, and that makes it sound like the flame may burn death itself. So the mausoleum knights probably wear deathbird ornamentation in the same way someone might wear hawk ornamentation to fight against snakes. By the way, I didn't actually mean to reference the Serpent Hunter's connection to Stormveil when I wrote that, but if the shoe fits. There are 2 spirits in Castle Sol that mention an eclipse, along with the revival of a soulless one, and the skill of Castle Sol's treasure, the Eclipse Shotel, mentions Godwyn, also known as the Prince of Death. It seems like the spirits may have worked with Miquella to try to bring about the Eclipsed Sun and allow Godwyn to be reborn, but never succeeded. One spirit implies that they'd never be able to see Miquella's Halig Tree because of this failure, and I think that this is because Miquella needed Godwyn to grow his Halig Tree into a full Erd Tree. The Halig Tree probably has a very close connection to Miquella, considering he watered it with his blood since it was a sapling, so I think he would need to become more powerful for the tree to fully grow. If Miquella needed Godwyn's help to gain this power, my best guess is that he was trying to find a consort to raise him to godhood, and Miquella considered Godwyn to be his only choice for some reason. In the middle of doing research for this video, I noticed the 3 medallions across the chest of the Guardian Garb. To be honest, I kind of freaked out because they represent the 3 stars that I happen to be talking about, and they ended up validating a lot of the ideas that I'd already written. The first medallion is a 6-pointed star, or the Blood Star. Then we have the 8-pointed star, or Eclipsed Sun, in the middle, and last is the Moon of Noxtella. Something that felt particularly validating was finding the moon on the 8-pointed star. The Eclipsed Sun's connections to life and death made it hard to tell how the 8-pointed star was related to it, and this medallion helped clear up a lot of doubts. Even stuff like the fact that the 8-pointed star is placed between the symbols of life and death feels like it fits into everything I've been discussing very nicely. I also noticed that the last medallion shows a circle with 4 other circles around it, which looks a lot like the Moon of Noxtella and the Fire Giant crest. Whether the symbols are connected or not, I think it's because they both represent death. The moon guides the dead, and the giant's flame is the only thing that can kill the Erd Tree. Also, I was able to find the mystery crest that I mentioned in my Magic Crest video. I want to give a big thanks to Arithia15 for her tweet about the crest, and Bonelord for bringing it to my attention. It's actually not a crest at all. It's a collection of 4 symbols that are stretched and placed throughout some rings that spawn during one of the Elden Beast's attacks. When the Elden Beast flies into the air and surrounds us with a ring that closes in on us, the symbols are placed all throughout the rings, on the ground, and the attack itself. If you liked this video, feel free to like and subscribe. My next video will probably be about the Rune of Death and Ghostflame, but if there's anything you'd really like me to cover, then let me know in the comments and I'll make sure I get to it in a future video. I make TikToks about Elden Ring lore and video game tips, and I stream Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. I read and respond to all my comments, so if there's anything you want to mention, please leave one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.